Good morning, sunshines. Hope you're doing well. If you were assigned a doll's house for your analysis, again, please send that to me and I will pass it along to everyone else in the class. A couple things about Doll's House before we get into today's lecture. Again, Ibsen wrote the play in 1871. It is the first play we have read that follows what we're going to call the realistic style. Again, realism is a movement in art that focuses on the everyday, the mundane, the things that are part of our real life. Not things you can imagine, but things that are physical reality in the external world. It was, again, developed mostly by philosophers more than anyone else, but it found its greatest use in the theater. And again, this is about 50 years before movies became the dominant style of theatrical production. So again, I'm going to say one of the things about realism is that once it raises its head, and again, you're talking about 1871 in Norway, of all crazy places, once it introduces itself, about 75-80% of all plays you're going to see today still are in this realistic style. So realism becomes the dominant style in theater, and again, I'm going to say a lot of it is because of movies and television that are going to come along in the aftermath, and it's just a much easier style to deal with when you're dealing with film and camera, because realism is out there. You don't have to change anything to have realism, whereas you have to alter the reality in order to create other things, expressionism, impressionism, all these other isms we're going to talk about in the coming days. Yes. Second thing, we'll just talk a little bit about the play itself. First of all, one of the things about realism is that there are no absolute good characters and absolute bad characters. As the play is set up, obviously Nora is the person who you care for in the play, but Nora tells her little white lies. She is deceitful in her own little way, sneaking in little chocolates. Again, you have to realize this is the end of the 19th century, and while I think we'll call it quaint, the relationship between Torvald and Nora, the husband-wife relationship is quaint, we'll call it. It certainly would be out of vogue today, I would say. As you watch it or read the play, my guess is you're going to be taken aback by the way that Torvald treats Nora and the way that Nora responds to it. They have their little games that they play. One of the things about the play, again, Krogstad is set up as the bad guy, but at the end of the play that you find that Krogstad has his own rational reasons for doing the things that he's doing, and ultimately Krogstad comes around and gives the bill of sale or the bill of the note back to Torvald and Nora. And he winds up with Christine. So he's a good guy as well as a bad guy. I mean, he's not a purely bad guy. There's good things about Krogstad as well. One of the things we talked about before, but we'll talk about it a little bit here as well. Once you start getting rid of things like soliloquies, like internal monologues, one of the devices that becomes very popular among the realists is this idea of symbolism. Again, we talked about what the difference between imagery and symbolism is. Again, an image is a fleeting idea. For instance, when she talks about how she is Torvald's little squirrel, and he says that she's his little bird. They're fleeting ideas, that she's jittering around, fluttering around, but it's not, I wouldn't say that it achieves the level of what I'm going to call a symbol. Whereas in the play, obviously the title of the play is A Doll's House. And in the course of the play, she talks about how she's moved from her father's influence to her husband's influence, and both of them treated her as if she were a little doll, and she treats her children like they are little dolls. And she realizes that that is not the right way that people should be treated. And I'm going to say, in A Doll's House, the idea of being a doll isn't just an image, it achieves the level of what I'm going to call a symbol. Dolls aren't always symbols, but in this play, the doll becomes the major symbol of the play. Yes, hopefully that makes sense to you. Again, it's a fine line, but it's just that one attains a certain significance that the other doesn't have. One is a very fleeting, very visceral idea that's just gone in a second, and one has a more lasting, permanent effect on the whole venue, and I would say that the idea of a doll's house in a doll's house attains that level of importance. Two more things before we leave doll's house. First of all, Dr. Rank has got a disease that they refer to, that he's sick, he's dying. There is this thing called syphilis. Syphilis is a venereal disease, which syphilis is passed down from the parent to the child. So when they talk about Dr. Rank suffering for the sins of his fathers, that's what they're talking about. The father had dalliances on the wrong side of the tracks, let's say, and came down with syphilis, and through the course of having the child pass the syphilis on to the child. It's one of the rare diseases that happens that way, but it is a blood disease that is passed down from the parents to the children. And there are other ways to get it, obviously. Torvald's father got it from other ways. But that's one of the things we're talking about. And again, in the latter half of the 19th century, you hadn't discovered yet penicillin, and so syphilis was a much more radical disease that was out there that people had to deal with, and that people wouldn't know what they were talking about. But because it was sexual in nature, you just hinted at it, you didn't really talk about it in direct terms the way we would today. Again, with the advent of penicillin, it has pretty much been eradicated from the modern world, but that's what they're talking about with Dr. Rank. The last thing, when Nora is talking about the miracle, she keeps expecting this miracle. The miracle that she is expecting is for when she is discovered to have lied on the loan statement. When she was discovered to have forged her dad's signature. She, in her mind's eye, has said to herself that Torvald will step forward as the man of the family and will accept full blame for it and will shield the wife from that penalty. When that doesn't happen, when he turns on her and casts her out basically and says you can't raise the children, that's a side of Torvald that she had never seen and didn't expect to see. It's obviously a side of Torvald because it's the same side that got rid of Krogstad at the beginning of the play. But she has turned a blind eye to that aspect of Torvald's character. And so when she has become aware of that he really is not the loving, caring person he has pretended to be to her, that's when the miracle doesn't happen and she falls, as she says, out of love with Torvald. Again, at the end of the play, when she leaves the house at the end of the play and leaves her husband in 1871, this would have been an unheard of event. Nobody would have done this in real life in 1871. Today, I would expect most of you, when you read it, may have been cheering her on, saying, get the hell out of that house. But that's the way things have changed in 150 years. Yes, hopefully, again, in 150 years from now, we'll be able to look back and notice how quaint some of the ways that we acted towards different races or different sexes in society, and know how much we have come along, although, we sometimes fall back depending upon the way the world works. Again, I've included the entire video there for you to watch for the play. It's pretty straightforward, hopefully, but if you do have any questions, please get a hold of me. All right, before we leave Ibsen, we'll just talk a little bit more about our good friend Heinrich. He was born in 1828, died in 1906 in Norway. He was, well, first of all, his family that he was born into was a middle-class family. His parents sort of ran a convenience store kind of thing. And at one point, when he was very young, in his early teens, his dad had been put into debtor's prison. And so he and his mother worked to pay for that debt. But one of the things he quickly realized was that society could be a bad thing, that the government could be used, because he knew that his dad was a good guy and he loved his dad dearly. But when the government is imprisoning him for a debt, and the mother and he had to come to terms with pay for the debt, he realized that society wasn't necessarily all it was worked out to be, and so he started seeking ways to change the society in which he found himself. He was very much into sociology. He was writing plays. Initially, again, the style of the period when he was growing up was Romanticism. He wrote a total of 27 plays, The first 2/3, 16 of them, were written in what I'm going to call this romantic style. His most famous play from this period of his life was Peer Gynt. Peer Gynt is the story of a man who sells his soul to the devil for eternal life, and quickly realizes that there's a time for every season, as they say. And so, as with most tales of people who have eternal life, it doesn't work out well. But again, it's a very romantic play about the workings of man and God and all this sort of stuff. Again, one of the problems he discovered with romanticizing in plays is that it didn't have the effect on culture that he was hoping to have. And so when he read about these realists and the movement that they were having and how they wanted to change society and reorder it and expose the ills in society, he purposely changed the way he wrote plays in order to expose the evil side of the underbelly of society. Again, his first realistic play was Doll's House in 1871. He tried to, as best he could, get rid of asides and soliloquies. There's still a couple times in the play when Nora will be talking to herself, like when she's decorating the Christmas tree. But I think for the most part, he's very successful at he certainly doesn't have Hamlet's soliloquies that go on for hours and hours. His basic theme in all of his plays was integrity, struggle for integrity, the struggle to find out and to be good. Yes, is the struggle of Ibsen. A lot of people today will call him the father of realism. That's a nice, easy answer on your question. But he certainly wrote in a different style than anyone had seen before. Now, there are the basic tenets, the basic beliefs of the realistic movement. There are 4 of them. First of all, is that you should depict reality truthfully, and reality was defined, second thing, as anything you can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. So the 5 senses. External reality, and your job as a playwright was to depict it truthfully. The third thing is that you should try to be objective, in other words, to take yourself out of the equation and let the characters be good and bad, as we all are. We all have things that are good about us. We all have things that are bad about us. The other thing is that because you are living, for instance, in 1871 in Norway, you know what it's like to live in Norway in 1871. The battle at the OK Corral also happened in 1871. What does Ibsen know about living in the wild, wild west? Yes? So even when I just say contemporaneous issues, I'm not even talking about the same year. I'm talking about where you live. You have to write plays that involve people that are like the people that you know and have the experiences that are similar to the experiences that you have had, because that's what you know in your relationship to the earth. So again, those are the 4 basic beliefs of the realist. And when Ibsen starts writing in this new style, many people start flocking to Norway to learn from him, but also learn how to write in this new style. People will bring him to Italy, for instance, to do his plays and present lectures and all that sort of stuff. Towards the end of his life, he became a very well-known traveler and very strong advocate for the realism. Yes. Now, one of the problems with this approach to plays is that before this period in time, the person who was most responsible for the action on the stage was the playwright. Actors certainly had an involvement, especially since the time of David Garrick had a voice. But for the most part, the playwright was the person who stepped forward and said, this person is good or this person is bad. And when they were in production of the play, the playwright would guide the production and figure out who was making what choices and how those choices could be made. With the advent of realism, if the author is striving to be objective, and again, let's just spend a second on objectivity. What does it mean to be objective? Well, the opposite of objective is subjective. Yes, to what is your thought? What do you believe? If you are striving as an author to be objective about a piece of work that you're writing, it's a little psychotic, because you're trying to take yourself out of the choices and words and what your characters are saying. But of course, you're the font of what they're saying. So at some level, that's not going to be possible. But the thing about it is, if you are ceding choices away from the playwright, right? If you're giving away the choices from the playwright to someone, the actor is a possibility, yes? But you're giving away the responsibility for interpreting the script from the playwright, who until this time has interpreted his own works or her own works. Now you're giving the play over to the actor or over to the other people involved in the play for interpretation, yes? And one of the first people to step forward to say, you know what, the person who should be in charge of a play was a man named Gordon Craig. Now, Gordon Craig lived from 1872 to 1966. He was the son of Ellen Terry, who was a famous English actress. Unfortunately for Gordon Craig, he apparently had a very high-pitched voice, and so a career as an actor was doomed from the start. But he still loved working in the theater, being around the theater. He worked as a stagehand in his youth, all that sort of stuff. And what he became was a set designer. And again, at the end of the 19th century, you also have the introduction of electric lighting. And so he also became one of the world's first lighting designers. Now, obviously we talked about the limelight last time being able to free you from the downstage area of the stage. And so you could then move about the stage more freely. Gordon Craig said that you should be able to, well, first of all, he said that the theater designer should be an independent artist. They shouldn't care what area or how the play had been written to be done or who the actors on the stage were. The theater designer was the person who should come up with the way the play was interpreted, because he argues that you went to see a play, not to hear a play. And since it was visually constructed, because the set designer was coming up with the physical environment, the set designer most logically should be the person to tell the actors where to stand on that environment so that you could create the entire image on stage. Lastly, he said the most important thing in the play was artistic unity. Again, like a painting, the look of the stage was the most important part of the stage. But again, as a set designer, that makes perfect sense that he would say these things. One of the things about Gordon Craig, he sort of stripped away, he sort of went the opposite way from reality, from realism. His designs are devoid of any artistic or architectural detail. Stairs are stairs, but they don't have any kind of artistic involvement in them. There's no handrails to tell you time period. There's just stairs up and down. The stages are enormous stages. They're big panels. Again, because he's designing light, the light can add color to the stage, all those sort of things. But he is the one who first comes forward and says the actor shouldn't be in charge. The playwright is no longer in charge, because Ibsen says that the playwright's not in charge. Gordon Craig argues that the set designer should be the person in charge. And Gordon Craig's very good friend at the very important time of their life was Adolf Appia. Now, Adolf Appia's family, first of all, he's from Switzerland. Appia was born in 1862, so he's about 10 years older. Died in 1928. Appia's father founded the Red Cross. So his father was an internationally known doctor. Appia himself eventually becomes a professor at the university in Switzerland, and he starts writing down, he and Gordon Craig would meet at the bar, have discussions about why the set designer should be in charge of the play, whereas Gordon Craig was the practitioner, the person who would go out and design the plays. He was working a lot with Richard Wagner, who we'll talk about in a little bit later. But he was developing all these grandiose designs. Appia was the one who was putting it in books. And so one of the things about, even though Gordon Craig was designing, Appia was actually making more money off of it because he was writing it in books that people were buying. And so he codified the beliefs of Gordon Craig. Now, first of all, let's talk about what a syllogism is. A syllogism is a false argument. You see it on Fox News and on MSNBC and all these things all the time. Just to give you an example, a syllogism. God is love. Hopefully all of you will agree with that. Love is blind. If you need proof of that, my wife married me. Third thing is, Stevie Wonder is blind. So logically, Stevie Wonder is God. Now, obviously that's not true. Hopefully that's obviously not true. That's an exaggerated syllogism. But the point of that is that if you're the one that's making the argument, and you can make the argument in a way that it sounds like you're covering all the bases. Obviously, if you're a set designer and you're trying to prove that the set designer should be in charge, Adolf Appia said there are three things. When you come into the stage, there are three things you see. There's the stage, there's the stage, the flat floor, there's the horizontal scenery, and there's the actor. Those are the three things you see on stage. And since he argues that you see two of the three things, and the set designer's in charge of the stage and the vertical scenery, he argues the set designer should also be in charge of the third thing, the actor. Now, truth be known, when you go see a play, you see a lot of other things. You see costumes, you see props, you see a lot of other things. But if you're trying to make the argument that the set designer should be in charge of where the actor moves about the stage, obviously you have an interest, a viable interest, in the set designer appearing to be the logical choice. And so both Appia and Craig put forward, that the set designer is the person who should be the major artist of the theater, and for a period in time, they are. Yes? Now, Gordon Craig got very upset that Appia was taking what he called his ideas and was making lots of money on them, so they broke up. Gordon Craig says, I'm out of here. Fortunately for Gordon Craig, there was a man in Russia named Konstantin Stanislavski. Now, Stanislavski lived from 1863 to 1938, and he founded this theater company in the latter half of the 19th century called the Moscow Art Theater. Now, one of the things about Stanislavski is he develops this new way of approaching acting that is a psychological approach to character interpretation. We talked about Freud last time. What he's using is the ideas of Freud and applying them to unrealistic, in other words, characters have no background, they have no history, they just exist on the page as written. We don't know anything about Nora other than what was in the play. But Stanislavski is going to his actors and saying, your job is to create that backstory. If you really were Nora Torvald, you would know what your father looked like, who your mother was, all these things that are not in the play. And Stanislavski said it's your job to figure out who that is. What is their past? What is their history? What is the relationship? Why did they go to Italy? Was it because Torvald was ill, or did he have a mental breakdown? Yes? You lied to yourself and you're lying to others, but on some level, Nora knows the answer, so does Torvald. Yes? And so one of the things that Stanislavski is doing is developing this new method, is what he calls it, a method approach. It is a psychological approach to character analysis. One of the things that he puts forward in going through this is lies. There are several times in plays where there are inconsistencies, where one person will say one thing about a character and somebody else will say something else about the character. They both can't be true. So which one is the lie and why? Or are they both half lies, or both half truths? And so one of the things he would do, and again, I'm just telling you my curriculum to my students, nobody's gonna lie to you in your life more than you lie to yourself. I think I'm a handsome, good-looking man. I can hear the laughs through the phone. Anyway, we all have our misconceptions about the world that we tell ourselves are true, yes? And so one of the things that Stanislavski encourages the actors in the plays to do is to go through and not only train vocally. Obviously you've got to be heard from the stage. This is before microphones are invented. So there is a certain amount of training physically, vocally, that you as an actor have to do. But in addition to that, he's encouraging actors to go through the script and analyze the script and make determinations about their characters and how they react to one another that adds subtext, not necessarily just subplots, but subtext to the play. Several of you did Cat on a Hot Tin Roof as your analysis for your third paper. In the play, Big Daddy has a crush, let's say, on Cat. So how does that manifest itself? Obviously, one of the roles that I've played in my life is Big Daddy, and so whenever she walks by, you leer at her. There's not a line there, but obviously if you've got a crush for the person, the way you react to that person should be obvious, or at least available to the audience for understanding, yes? And so the way you move, how you move, where you move on stage, who you're attracted to in life, that sort of stuff. One of the most interesting things that I always love doing at parties is seeing who navigates closest to one another. When you walk into a party, you can go anywhere in the room. Who do you walk to? Who walks to you? Who are the cliques? Who are the people that are like each other? Yes? Now, it may not be obvious to the two people who are talking to each other, but they keep winding up at different parties talking to each other. Obviously, there's some sort of a connection there that they may be in denial about themselves. Yes? And so again, this is the approach that Stanislavski is having. Now, one of the problems, of course, is as a theater manager, you need plays to do. And so he had to find himself a playwright. And so there's this man, well, first of all, let's watch a little video about Stanislavski and the method. Sorry, I didn't mean to go too far.
If you've studied acting in the West, then you've probably experienced some version of Stanislavski's system. But here's the thing, we don't really know what that system is. Stanislavski was always changing it. In addition to Stanislavski's autobiography, we have 3 books: An Actor Prepares, Building a Character, and Creating a Role, all translated into English by Elizabeth Hapgood. But it turns out that Hapgood mistranslated a lot of stuff. As for the Russian originals, the Soviets made their own edits. And the aspect of the system that's most famous in America, the part where actors are supposed to rely on their personal memories, Stanislavski later discounted. But there are a few parts that we can pretty much agree on. An actor's body and voice should be thoroughly trained, and an actor should have a thorough knowledge of other stage techniques like combat, dancing, all that stuff. Actors should observe how people behave in real life. Before rehearsals begin, the cast will study the play, investigating its themes and the motivations and the emotional arc of each character, and deciding on each character's primary objective and emotional through line. In order to make characters feel psychologically real, actors will familiarize themselves with a character's given circumstances and ask how a person would behave within those circumstances. This is called the magic if. At one point, Stanislavski did suggest that actors should work with their own emotion memory to inhabit a role, but he later moved away from this and encouraged more expressive physical explorations and improvisations. On stage, actors should try to live in the moment, reacting with some emotional spontaneity and giving the illusion of the first time. And finally, actors must always keep working toward greater proficiency and skill. The Stanislavski system, or the less than 100% faithful version of it that we have today, dominates Western theater, film and television too. Every single one of my friends who studied acting in college took a Stanislavski class. Of course.
So there's a little bit about Stanislavski and his method approach. He went out and he looked around and he found this person, Anton Chekov, who was, and I love this will not be on the test, but he was from Tangarangarong, Russia. I just like saying Tangarangarong. He was from a little mountainous region, and the city that he was born in was called Tangarangarong. Did I mention he was born in Tangarangarong? It took me about 6 months to learn how to say that. He was born in 1860, died in 1904. His father died of tuberculosis when he was 4, and his mother, he had to care for her for the first 16 years of his life or so, because she also had it, but not as severely as her father had it. He eventually died of tuberculosis as well. He lived to be, 44 years old, so he eventually dies from tuberculosis as well. But he, in Tangarangarong, he trained to be a doctor, and in the evenings he would go home and care for his indolent mother, and he would write little short stories, and he would send it off basically to the Reader's Digest of the day in Russia. And he wrote about 300 short stories over the period of time. And Stanislavski had seen these short stories and enjoyed the characters. I would say, as a matter of fact, Chekov was one of the people most responsible for popularizing the form of a short story and elevating it to the same level as a novel. There are many people in literature and English department who say that novels, the short stories just aren't as well written or as insightful as novels can be. Novels certainly last a lot longer and cover a great deal more territory, but a short story can delve into a day or a moment or an activity as aggressively or as involved as a novel ever was. And Chekhov was one of the first people to come along and write in that style. Again, just a little short video here on Chekhov, just to introduce you to Chekhov.
Into this world arrived Anton Chekhov, Russia's greatest playwright and a man who really knew his way around a samovar. Chekhov was born in 1860. His paternal grandfather had been a serf. Chekhov trained as a doctor, and though he continued to practice medicine, he devoted himself to literature, mostly as a short story writer at first. Just as he finished medical school, he developed tuberculosis, but he was financially responsible for his family, so he ignored it. A few years later, he wrote his first produced play, Ivanov. But even though it was a hit, Chekhov considered it a disappointment. In 1895, he wrote his first major dramatic work, The Seagull. It was produced the next year, and it flopped hard. The actors didn't know their lines, the audience booed like crazy. Chekhov ran out of the theater in the middle of the second act and said that he would never write another play. But a writer and theater director named Vladimir Nemirovich Dechenko loved the play and remounted it at the newly founded Moscow Art Theater. Chekhov then wrote 3 more major works: Uncle Vanya, The Three Sisters, and The Cherry Orchard. So what makes these plays so indelible? Well, even though Chekhov's plays are full of incidents like murders and attempted murders and suicides and attempted suicides and who is gonna pay the mortgage, they're some of the first plays to feel like life. Because here's the thing, Chekhov knew that life doesn't include a lot of climaxes or cliffhangers or neat speeches that explain everything. Most of the time it's just about playing cards or going for a walk or having a late night vodka sesh. He wrote, "In life, people do not shoot themselves or hang themselves or fall in love or deliver themselves of clever sayings every minute. They spend most of their time eating, drinking, running after women or men, or talking nonsense. It is therefore necessary that this should be shown on stage. Life on the stage should be as it really is, and the people too should be as they are." This doesn't mean that nothing happens in Chekhov's plays, or that what happens doesn't matter. Plenty happens, and it does matter, but Chekhov was also comfortable writing scenes that are just less eventful, and it's those scenes that have the texture of life. He also meant many of these scenes to be funny, and often fought with his serious-minded directors to make them funnier. He was a master of subtext, a kind of misdirection in which characters can't or won't say what they really mean, but the meaning emerges anyway, around and under and between the lines. Let's take it.
Yes? So, in his whole life, he only wrote 5 plays. And I would say that the 4 latter plays, he wrote a play, Ivanov, which was never really produced during his lifetime. But most of the storylines that were in the rest of his plays, his other 4 plays, were somehow suggested in his first major work, Ivanov. The first play to be produced, as you saw in the video, is a play called The Seagull. It was actually a huge failure the first year it was produced, and then the Moscow Art Theater took it and made it into a tragedy, because Chekhov thought it was comedy. I thought it was hysterical that this little kid would shoot himself over the love of an actress. But it became a huge success the second time it was performed in Russia. And again, Chekhov writes in a very realistic style. He has what's called a zero ending. And what I mean by that, what scholars mean by that, is that at the end of the play, nothing has changed from the beginning of the play. And that is true of most of us. For most of us, most days of our life, at the end of the day, we are the same person we were at the beginning of the day. Now, obviously, there are things that happen, people getting hit by cars, tornadoes coming through. There are events in your life that hopefully you will avoid, most of them, that will change who you are and how you approach the world. But in Chekhov's plays, his point is that may be days in lives, but mostly what our life is the mundane, the everyday. And that's the type of play that Chekhov wrote. Again, Gordon Craig comes into this and he becomes the set designer for Stanislavski at the Moscow Art Theater. There was a very famous production of Macbeth that he designed that became world famous, and everyone was flocking to Russia to see these interpretations of various plays. Again, the problem with the actor becomes so self-centered on their particular character is that they weren't able then to see how everyone else would react or how everyone else would move. We're all making our own individual choices. We still need somebody to interpret the play or to guide us in our interpretation of our characters. And the person who set up the mold that becomes the answer to the problem is a man that we're going to call the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen. Duke of Saxe-Meiningen was born in 1826. He dies in 1914. When he is young, his father is Georg I, who is the King of Luxembourg. Now, my guess is last night you were wondering what we're going to talk about, and Luxembourg was not high on your list. Luxembourg is the smallest country in Western Europe. It's an actual country. It is sort of in the little V between France and Germany today. One of the problems, there used to be this country called Prussia. Prussia was a very powerful nation in the 19th century, and there was this huge war between Prussia and Germany and Russia. And unfortunately for the Prussians, the Russians and the Germans won. And unfortunately for Georg I, he had sided with Prussia. So in the latter half of the 19th century, in 1870-ish, once, about the time that our good friend Ibsen is writing Doll's House, Prussia falls, and Luxembourg is now under the guise, or under the thumb, basically, of Germany. And so, in order to appease the Germans, in other words, to keep Germany out of Luxembourg, Georg I steps down and allows them to put his son, the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, in charge. Now, the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen had been raised going to school in Rome, in Paris, in London. He was a playboy. He would go out to parties, all these places. Well, the problem with being the king of a country is you sort of have to live in that country. And so, in order to keep these relationships that he developed as a young man, Georg II is who the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen becomes. We're going to keep calling him the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, though. The Duke of Saxe-Meiningen builds the world's largest theater. It seated about 4,000 people, a little over 4,000 people. And he starts producing plays in Luxembourg and inviting all of his friends from London, from Paris, from Rome to come see these plays. Now, the thing about it is, he didn't write a play. He just hired people to write the play. He didn't design the play. He just hired people to design the sets, the costumes. Again, by this time, developed the lighting design, all that sort of stuff. So he had the most technologically advanced theater in the world, had all the bells and whistles that you could have because he was, the king of Luxembourg. And so he independently developed this role of a theater artist that we're going to call the director. From the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen on, there is a person who is in charge of interpreting the play, and the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen set it up that that person should be an independent artist, not the playwright who has something in the play they've invested, not the actor who has something invested, they're performing the play, not the designer. Set designer has certainly in charge of the visuals, but they have too much invested in the visuals to necessarily understand the placement of the actors on stage. And so this new role of the director is accidentally, he didn't mean to invent this role, he just accidentally creates this new role of a director. Now, it isn't up to the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, though, to make this decision. He creates this role, and Richard Wagner, yes, is the leading composer during this time period of operas. Again, Gordon Craig had worked with him a lot. Adolphe Appia begins to work with him. Here's a little video about Richard Wagner. Get you caught up on Wagner and his operas.
Wagner is the most influential composer who ever lived.
Richard Wagner was born on May 22, 1813, in Leipzig, Germany. His stepfather instilled him with a love of theater, and by 21, Wagner wrote The Fairies, his first opera.
Wagner was devoted to the theater from an early age. In fact, at age 15, he actually considered that he would become more of a playwright than a composer. And he wrote a drama, and in classic Wagnerian style, it was full of murder and insanity and quite the tragedy.
In 1840, he became the first music director of the theater in Riga, Russia. But it was in Dresden, Germany, in 1842, when Wagner staged Rienzi, that he became a noted composer.
Wagner wrote a number of operas sort of to learn the trade, and one, Rienzi, had some success. But it's really with The Flying Dutchman and Tannhäuser and Lohengrin that he begins to develop a prominent career.
Due to his controversial politics, Wagner was forced to leave Dresden for Zurich in 1848 and spent 12 years in exile.
Wagner is justifiably known today as a racist and sort of proto-Nazi in a way. He was extremely anti-Semitic. Wagner had been, yes, a revolutionary socialist at the time of the 1848 revolution, but his later writings actually had a great influence on Hitler.
During his time in Zurich, Wagner wrote a set of notable essays entitled The Artwork of the Future, and at the same time began work on the four-opera cycle, The Ring of Nibelung.
Wagner developed a concept called Gesamtkunstwerk, total artwork. His idea was to combine dance, poetry, the stagecraft of the theater, lighting, and of course, music. And through that, transcend anything that had been previously experienced before in the theater.
With The Ring of the Nibelung, Wagner's musical and dramatic ideas really began to gel. Specifically, it was sort of the crowning creation of his leitmotivic technique, the method of creating a musical theme or a musical motif for every character, place, thing, event, even idea in an opera. And it was actually adopted by Hollywood in the 30s and 40s, and we see it, of course, in the John Williams scores for the Star Wars saga.
During an adulterous love affair, Wagner wrote his opera of forbidden love, Tristan and Isolde, which he completed in 1859 and saw it staged 6 years later.
Tristan and Isolde is one about young lovers that desire each other, and to convey this desire, Wagner wrote what we call chromatic music. It's music that doesn't resolve, that you feel a constant sort of yearning, and it only is resolved when the characters die at the end. But the impact of this type of writing, even for composers that never wrote operas themselves, was enormous.
Wagner completed his final opera Parsifal in 1882, and the following year he died of a heart attack at the age of 69. But Wagner's influence can still be heard in modern film scores such as Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter.
The path of music changed forever with Wagner. He pushed harmony, he pushed form, he pushed drama to levels that had never before been seen.
Again, if you've ever heard the phrase, the play ain't over till the fat lady sings, comes from Wagnerian opera. Usually there's a nice little aria with a very large female soprano at the very end of his operas. Anyway, Wagner is, because he is the composer and he hires these designers, he's not only writing and conducting the orchestra, he's also telling the various singers, performers where to stand on the stage. And the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen invites Wagner over to Luxembourg, and Wagner goes over and says, you know what, this is fantastic. This is a great idea, having somebody who is not me in charge of telling those actors and singers where to stand on stage is a fantastic idea. And so Wagner comes forward to the rest of the world and says, this is, my friend, the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, has created this role of a person, we're going to call him the director. Now, Wagner says the person in charge should be the director. And the director should be in charge of what he calls continuous style. In other words, the costumes should match the set, should match the music. Everything should be tailor-made to go together. If you ever played one of the operas that was popular during his time period, an opera called Carmen. Carmen happens, it wasn't written by Wagner, but it's an example. Carmen happens in Spain. The music is very Spanish. The costumes are very Spanish. The whole thing takes place in bull rings and all that sort of stuff, very Spanish. And so that's what I mean by continuous style. The music goes along with the dress, goes along with the costumes, everything, or goes along with the set. Everything has is thought out and has a look and a feel and a sound to it that all joins together. It looks like it's from the same material. The last thing is the idea that the sole job of the theater artist and therefore the director is to be that of a myth maker. Now, where Wagner gets in trouble, first of all, he's very anti-Semitic. He for whatever reason, he is a Jew hater. And he has this idea of being a myth maker, that we each have our own myths. The Germans have their myth, that French have their myths, that the English have their myths, and that each of those societies should nurture and cherish their own myth-making ability, yes, by isolating each, compartmentalizing each. It means that the other is relegated to being kicked out of that world. And Hitler's going to use this idea in order to cleanse the state, to take those who are not German and to rid German society of the not us. Yeah, so that's where some of Wagner's beliefs get future generations in trouble. But the big thing about Wagner for this class is that Wagner was the one who said that the role that the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen had created for the theater artist called a director should be the leading artist. And because Wagner was a leading artist in the world and everybody listened to Wagner, everyone accepted it, and almost overnight, again, you're talking about 1870 with both ideas, realism comes to the fore, and the idea of a person called the director who is in charge of the production comes around. And for the rest, from then on, both those things are true. Realism is the most important style in theater, and the director is the person who is in charge of interpreting the play from then on. Accidentally created by the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, affirmed by Richard Wagner as the person who should be in charge, and the rest of the world just accepted now that there's this role called the director that had never been around before this, who should be the leading artist in the theater, and it is that way even unto today. Yes? All right, thank you very much, and next time we'll continue our little discussion on the shape of things. See you then.